In the opening years of the 14th century, Europe stood on the edge of a precipice it could not see. For generations, the continent had sustained a delicate balance between the land and the people who worked it, a balance that depended almost entirely on the annual cycle of planting and harvest. Medieval Europe's food system was built on grain, wheat, and rye primarily, with oats and barley filling out the fields that stretched across the countryside. These crops were not simply staples, but the foundation of survival itself, the difference between life and death for millions of peasants who lived at the mercy of each growing season. What made this system so precarious was its complete lack of resilience. Storage techniques were primitive at best, and most communities held no reserves beyond what a single harvest could provide. When the grain ran out, there was nothing to fall back on, no hidden stores or emergency supplies waiting in reserve. For the vast majority of the population, subsistence living was not a condition, but a fact of existence. Peasant families produced just enough food to keep themselves alive, and often not even that much once their obligations were met. These obligations were crushing and inescapable. Feudal society demanded its tribute in multiple forms. Peasants owed rents to their lords, tithes to the church, and various feudal dues that could be paid in grain, in labor, or in both. After these payments were extracted, what remained for the family was whatever meager surplus they could scrape together. And for most, there was no surplus at all. The system was designed to extract everything the land could give, leaving those who worked it with almost nothing to show for their labor beyond bare survival. By the turn of the 14th century, Europe's population had swelled to numbers that pushed the continent to the very limits of what its agricultural system could sustain. Scholars estimate that by 1300, the population had reached a saturation point, perhaps as many as 70 to 80 million people competing for the resources of finite land. In response to this pressure, communities had begun cultivating marginal lands, hillsides and wetlands and thin soils that in better times would never have been touched by the plow. These lands were poor producers, vulnerable to flooding and erosion, but desperation left no alternative. Every available acre was pressed into service. It was the peasants who bore the weight of this fragile system, and it was the peasants who would suffer most when it collapsed. They had no surplus capital, no savings to draw upon when disaster struck. They had no mobility, bound as they were to the land by law and custom, unable to flee to better opportunities, even if such opportunities existed. And perhaps most tellingly, they had no safety net whatsoever. There were no state welfare systems, no emergency relief programs, no institutions designed to catch them when they fell. When the harvest failed, they starved, and the world simply carried on. The disaster began not with war or plague, but with rain. In the spring of 1314, the skies over northern and western Europe opened, and they did not close again. What started as unseasonable weather became something far more ominous, a relentless deluge that continued month after month, with scarcely a break. The rain was cold and unceasing, falling through the planting season and into summer, turning fields into quagmires and roads into rivers of mud. This was not the typical variability of European weather, but something unprecedented in living memory, a fundamental shift in climate patterns that would persist for years. The agricultural consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Crops that had been planted in the spring of 1314 never had a chance. Grain rotted in waterlogged fields before it could mature, the stalks collapsing under the weight of constant moisture and lack of sunlight. Seeds that farmers had carefully sown failed to germinate in the cold, saturated soil, and those that did manage to sprout were quickly drowned or succumbed to disease. The hay harvests, essential for feeding livestock through the winter, were utterly destroyed. Wet hay cannot be stored without rotting, and what little could be salvaged was insufficient. Without fodder, animals began to starve, and farmers were forced to slaughter breeding stock they could not feed, eliminating their capacity to recover, even when conditions improved. The nightmare did not end with a single bad year. The harvest of 1315 failed, as completely as the one before it. In 1316, the rain continued, and in some regions the catastrophe extended into 1317. 3 consecutive years of failure was something the medieval agricultural system simply could not absorb. Communities that might have endured 1 lean year found themselves with nothing left after 2, and nothing at all after 3. Recovery became impossible because the famine consumed the very tools needed for future production. In normal times, a portion of each harvest was carefully set aside as seed grain for the following year's planting. But as starvation set in, desperate families made an unbearable choice. They ate the seed grain. There was no backup year, no reserve harvest waiting to carry them through. When people are dying of hunger, the future becomes an abstraction that cannot compete with the immediate need to survive another day. By consuming their seed stores, communities destroyed their own capacity to plant new crops, ensuring that even if the weather improved, they would have nothing to sow. The cycle of production was broken, and with it, any hope of a swift return to normalcy. As the grain stores dwindled and the rain continued to fall, peasant families across Europe were forced into a grinding calculus of survival. The first and most immediate response was rationing, a deliberate reduction in food intake that began as a precaution, but quickly became a desperate necessity. Meals that had once been taken 2 or 3 times a day were cut back to once daily, and eventually even that single meal shrank to portions that could barely sustain life. Families stretched what little bread they had by adulterating it with anything that could add bulk. Bran and husks, normally fed to animals, were ground into the flour. Tree bark was stripped, dried, and pulverized into a gritty powder that could be mixed with whatever grain remained. The resulting bread was dark, bitter, and nearly indigestible, but it filled stomachs even if it provided little actual nourishment. Within households, a cruel hierarchy of feeding emerged. In times of plenty, families ate together, but scarcity imposed brutal priorities. Working men, whose labor in the fields was essential to any hope of future survival, were fed first and given the largest portions. Women received less, and children and the elderly were often fed last, if at all. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but a cold calculation born of desperation. If the family was to have any chance of enduring, those who could work had to be kept alive. The weak, the very young, and the very old became expendable in a system that had no margin for compassion. Chronic malnutrition became the norm across entire regions. Bodies weakened, immune systems collapsed, and a generation of children grew up stunted and sickly, their development permanently compromised by years of inadequate food. When the grain was gone, people turned to whatever the land and forest could provide, foods that in normal times would never have been considered fit for human consumption. Women and children scoured the countryside for wild plants, gathering nettles, dandelion roots, and whatever grasses they could find. These were boiled into thin soups or eaten raw, providing some minimal sustenance, but little in the way of calories or nutrition. Acorns and chestnuts, which grew abundantly in the forests, became staples despite the danger they posed. Raw acorns contain toxic tannins that can cause severe illness, and while proper processing through repeated leaching could make them safe, starving people often lacked the time or knowledge to prepare them correctly. Many ate them anyway, accepting the risk of poisoning over the certainty of starvation. As desperation deepened, the definition of food expanded to include anything with flesh. Cats and dogs, traditionally kept as companions or working animals, were slaughtered and eaten. Horses, invaluable for plowing and transport, were killed when there was no grain to feed them, their meat providing a temporary reprieve from hunger, even as their loss made future farming impossible. Rodents were trapped and roasted. There are documented accounts of people consuming animals that had died of disease, the meat rotten and dangerous, because there was simply nothing else. This was not selective foraging, but indiscriminate consumption, driven by the body's demand for calories at any cost. Farmers also made the agonizing decision to slaughter their livestock early, before the animals could starve to death. In a functioning agricultural economy, livestock represented wealth and future productivity. Cows provided milk and calves. Sheep gave wool and lambs. Pigs could be bred for future litters. But when the hay harvest failed and winter fodder ran out, keeping animals alive became impossible. Slaughtering them while they still had some meat on their bones at least provided food in the short term, even though it meant the complete destruction of the family's capital and any hope of rebuilding their herds when conditions improved. Communities that had maintained flocks and herds for generations watched them disappear in a matter of months. Centuries of careful animal husbandry erased by a few seasons of catastrophic weather. Perhaps the most devastating survival strategy, and the one that guaranteed the famine would persist even after the rain stopped, was the consumption of seed grain. Every farming culture understands the sacred principle that a portion of the harvest must be preserved for planting the following year. This seed grain was meant to be inviolable, protected even in times of scarcity, because without it, there could be no future crop. But as the famine entered its second and third years, families faced an impossible choice. They could preserve the seed and starve immediately, or they could eat it and survive a few weeks longer. Inevitably, hunger won. The seed grain was ground into flour and consumed, and with it went any possibility of planting a full crop when spring arrived. This was survival purchased at the price of future collapse. Even when the weather finally stabilized and the rain ceased, fields across Europe lay fallow because there was nothing to plant. Those farmers who had managed to hold back a small amount of seed found themselves surrounded by neighbors who had none, and the resulting harvests were fractional compared to what had been normal before the famine. The decision to eat the seed grain was not irrational but tragically rational, the choice of people who could not afford to think beyond the next meal. Yet it transformed what might have been a terrible but finite crisis into a prolonged catastrophe that would take years to overcome, ensuring that hunger remained a constant companion long after the skies had cleared. As the famine tightened its grip, the economic fabric of village life began to unravel. Peasant families, who had already exhausted their food supplies, turned to the only assets they possessed, selling off their belongings piece by piece in a futile attempt to purchase grain that often did not exist. Tools that had been passed down through generations, the plows and scythes and axes that were essential to farming, went to market first. Women sold their clothing, stripping themselves down to rags in exchange for a few days' worth of bread. Furniture was dragged from cottages and offered for whatever it might fetch, Family heirlooms, objects that carried sentimental value and represented the accumulated wealth of lifetimes, were surrendered to merchants and traders who understood that desperation had eliminated any possibility of negotiation. Prices collapsed for goods and soared for food, creating a perverse market where a fine woolen cloak might be traded for a single loaf of bread. But even this strategy had strict limits. Once everything had been sold, there was nothing left to exchange, and families found themselves destitute in every sense, stripped not only of food, but of the basic materials needed for survival and future recovery. The physical landscape of rural Europe began to change as the famine persisted. Marginal plots of land, those hillsides and wetlands that had been pressed into cultivation during the population boom of the previous century, were abandoned first. These lands had never been productive, and without sufficient labor or seed to work them, they simply reverted to wilderness. Even better lands were left fallow, as families lacked the strength, the tools, or the draft animals needed to plow and plant. Entire villages, particularly those in remote or less fertile areas, were partially or completely deserted. The peasants who remained were too few and too weak to maintain the fields that had once fed their communities. Houses stood empty, their thatched roofs collapsing and their gardens overgrown. The depopulation was visible and shocking, a testament to how quickly a functioning society could disintegrate when its food supply disappeared. For those with the strength and courage to move, migration offered a slim hope of survival, though it came with enormous risks. Peasants were legally bound to the land they worked, tied to their lords by feudal obligations that made departure a crime. Yet as starvation became unbearable, thousands chose to flee regardless of the consequences. Some made their way to towns and cities, hoping that urban centers with their markets and trade networks might have access to food that rural areas lacked. Others moved toward regions rumored to have experienced less severe weather or better harvests, traveling on foot across distances that in their weakened state often proved fatal. This mass movement created a surge in vagrancy that terrified medieval authorities. Roads filled with desperate, starving people, many of them sick, and all of them dangerous in the eyes of settled communities. Town gates were closed to refugees, and local authorities imposed harsh measures to prevent the influx of outsiders who might compete for scarce resources. Vagrants were beaten, imprisoned, or forcibly returned to their home villages, where starvation awaited them. The legal and social structures that had kept the feudal system functioning for centuries were breaking down, but the response from those in power was repression rather than relief. As the traditional money economy proved useless in the face of absolute scarcity, communities reverted to older, more primitive forms of exchange. Barter became the dominant mode of transaction, with goods traded directly for food in whatever arrangements could be negotiated. A blacksmith might exchange his services for grain. A weaver might trade cloth for vegetables, and those with nothing to offer but labor would work for meals. Money itself became nearly worthless because coins could not be eaten, and there was often nothing available to purchase, even for those who had silver or gold. Markets that had once operated on prices set by supply and demand now functioned through desperate haggling, where the value of any object was measured solely by how much food it could command. This collapse of the monetary economy was temporary, but it revealed how fragile the commercial structures of medieval society truly were. When the fundamental assumption that food would be available for purchase was violated, the entire system of trade and exchange simply ceased to function in any recognizable form. The village economy had been reduced to its most basic elements, people trading whatever they had for whatever might keep them alive one more day. The Great Famine did not merely starve bodies, but corroded the social bonds that held communities together. Medieval society, for all its inequalities and brutalities, had operated under certain understood obligations, codes of behavior that governed how people treated one another, even in difficult times. Chief among these was the expectation of charity, the belief that those with resources had a duty to help those without. The Church preached this as a moral imperative, and villages had long maintained informal systems of support for widows, orphans, and the destitute. But the famine obliterated these customs with ruthless efficiency. When everyone was starving, charity became impossible. Villages that had once cared for their poor simply could not do so anymore because there was nothing to give. The grain stores that might have fed the vulnerable were empty, and families that would have shared in better times now guarded their meager supplies with fierce protectiveness. The social safety net, threadbare as it had always been, disappeared entirely, and the most vulnerable members of society found themselves utterly alone. As hunger intensified, so too did crime, particularly theft. Food became the most valuable commodity in existence, worth more than gold or land, and people who had never before broken a law found themselves driven to steal simply to survive. Grain stores, mills, and bakeries became targets for desperate raids. Fields were stripped of crops before they could be harvested, and even meager household supplies were stolen from neighbors. The response from authorities was savage. In normal times, theft might be punished with fines or public shaming, but during the famine, food theft was treated as a capital crime. People were hanged for stealing a loaf of bread, their bodies left dangling as warnings to others who might be contemplating the same act. Yet the executions did little to stem the tide of crime, because the alternative to stealing was death by starvation, and many chose to risk the gallows rather than waste away slowly. Banditry exploded across the countryside as bands of desperate men, many of them former soldiers or displaced peasants, turned to organized robbery. They ambushed travelers, raided villages, and seized whatever food they could find, operating with a violence born of their own hunger. The roads became dangerous, and the distinction between legitimate authority and criminal enterprise began to blur as even some local officials resorted to extortion and theft to feed themselves and their families. Within the most intimate unit of society, the family itself, the famine imposed unbearable pressures that shattered traditional bonds. Parents faced decisions that under normal circumstances would be unthinkable. Children, particularly the very young who consumed food but could not contribute labor, were sometimes abandoned. Infants were left at church doors or simply deposited by roadsides, their parents hoping that someone else might have the resources to care for them, though in reality most of these children died within days. Older children were sent away to fend for themselves, cast out to reduce the number of mouths a family had to feed. The elderly, who in peasant culture had traditionally been cared for by their adult children, were left to die. Some were given a final small portion of food and then neglected, allowed to fade away in corners of cottages, while the rest of the family focused on keeping the able-bodied alive. Others were simply turned out, told to seek charity that did not exist, or to find their own way in a world that had no place for those who could not work. These were not acts of casual cruelty, but choices made by people who had been pushed beyond the limits of what human beings can endure, forced to decide which members of their family would live and which would be sacrificed. The most extreme and horrifying evidence of social collapse came in the form of behaviors that violated the deepest taboos of Christian Europe. Cannibalism, though rare, was documented in multiple regions during the worst years of the famine. Chronicles from the period record instances of people consuming human flesh, acts so shocking that medieval writers struggled to describe them. In some cases, the bodies of the recently dead were dug up from graves and butchered for meat. In others, there are accounts of murders committed specifically to obtain flesh for food, though the reliability of such reports is difficult to verify and may have been exaggerated by horrified observers. What is certain is that the consumption of executed criminals became documented fact in several famine zones. After public hangings or beheadings, crowds would descend on the bodies, cutting away flesh before authorities could intervene. The meat was taken home cooked and eaten by people who had been reduced to such desperation that the normal revulsion toward cannibalism was overridden by the body's demand for protein and calories. These acts were not widespread, and it is important not to overstate their frequency, but their very existence reveals the depth of the catastrophe. Medieval Europe was a profoundly Christian society where the integrity of the body and the sanctity of burial were fundamental beliefs. The willingness of even a small number of people to violate these principles demonstrated that the famine had pushed human beings into a space beyond conventional morality, where survival instincts overwhelmed religious teaching and social conditioning. The moral fabric of society, like its economic and social structures, had been torn apart, leaving communities traumatized not only by starvation, but by what they had been forced to witness and, in some cases, to do. The institutions that governed medieval society found themselves tested by the famine in ways that exposed both their limitations and their priorities. The response from those in power was uneven, shaped by self-interest, theological interpretation, and the practical constraints of a collapsing economy. For the peasants who looked to their superiors for protection and relief, what they received was often disappointment, indifference, or outright exploitation. Feudal lords, who controlled the land and held ultimate authority over the peasants who worked it, had the capacity to provide meaningful relief, but rarely chose to do so. Some lords, recognizing that dead peasants could pay no rents and work no fields, temporarily reduced the financial obligations owed to them. These concessions were pragmatic, rather than compassionate, designed to ensure that enough of the peasant population survived to resume normal productivity once the crisis passed. But such lords were the exception. The majority continued to demand full payment of rents, tithes, and feudal dues, even as their tenants starved. Grain hoarding became widespread among the nobility, who had the storage capacity and armed retainers necessary to protect their supplies from desperate mobs. While peasants consumed seed grain and foraged for roots, aristocratic granaries remained stocked, their contents reserved for the lord's household, his soldiers, and perhaps for sale, at inflated prices to those few who still had money. The enforcement of traditional obligations became, if anything, more severe during the famine years. Lords who might have turned a blind eye to minor infractions in times of plenty now cracked down harshly on any violation of their rights. Poaching, the illegal hunting of game on aristocratic lands, had always been forbidden. But during the famine it was punished with a brutality that reflected the nobility's determination to preserve their privileges. Peasants caught trapping rabbits or deer were hanged or mutilated, their desperation treated not as a mitigating factor, but as irrelevant to the maintenance of feudal order. Theft of grain, even in tiny quantities, met with execution. The message from the ruling class was clear. The crisis did not suspend their rights, and the suffering of the lower orders did not obligate them to sacrifice their own comfort or wealth. The Church, which in theory represented spiritual authority and Christian charity, struggled to fulfill its pastoral mission in the face of such overwhelming need. Bishops and priests organized prayers, public fasts, and religious processions intended to appeal to God for relief from the catastrophe. These rituals were performed with genuine devotion, as the clergy and laity alike believed that the famine might be divine punishment for sin or a test of faith. Villages marched behind crosses and relics, singing hymns and begging for divine intervention, seeking supernatural solutions to a crisis they could not understand in natural terms. The church did attempt to provide almsgiving, the distribution of food to the poor, which had always been one of its central charitable functions. But the scale of the famine overwhelmed these efforts. Monasteries and cathedrals, which typically maintained grain stores for exactly this purpose, found their own supplies running dangerously low. What could be given was distributed, but it amounted to drops in an ocean of need. Some individual monasteries distinguished themselves as centers of relief, opening their doors to the starving and sharing what they had until their stores were exhausted. These acts of charity were genuine and sometimes heroic, but they were localized and insufficient to address a continent-wide disaster. The theological framing of the famine as divine punishment created its own complications. If starvation was God's will, a chastisement for humanity's sins, then perhaps it was not meant to be resisted, but endured. This perspective, while not universal, dampened the urgency of relief efforts in some quarters and allowed the comfortable to rationalize inaction as acceptance of divine judgment. Urban authorities, governing towns and cities that depended entirely on the countryside for food, faced a different set of challenges. Unlike rural areas where at least some emergency foraging was possible, cities had no fields to glean and no forests to scavenge. When the grain supply failed, urban populations were immediately threatened with starvation. Town councils responded by attempting to impose price controls, setting maximum prices for bread and grain in an effort to prevent merchants from exploiting the crisis. These measures were well-intentioned, but largely ineffective. Price controls could not conjure food into existence, and when supplies were genuinely scarce, merchants simply refused to sell at the mandated prices, preferring to hoard their goods or smuggle them to regions where they could charge whatever the market would bear. Some cities enacted grain import bans or anti-hoarding laws, trying to ensure that whatever food entered the town would stay there and be distributed rather than warehoused by speculators. Enforcement was spotty at best, undermined by corruption, lack of manpower, and the sheer difficulty of monitoring every transaction in a chaotic market. City authorities also attempted to monitor markets, stationing officials to prevent fraud and ensure fair dealing, but the markets themselves were chronically undersupplied. The grain that did arrive was fought over by desperate buyers, and riots became common as crowds attacked merchants they believed were withholding food or charging unconscionable prices. Urban governments found themselves in an impossible position, tasked with maintaining order and ensuring food distribution in a situation where there simply was not enough food to distribute. The result was a patchwork of failed interventions, temporary expedients, and brutal crackdowns on unrest that did little to address the underlying crisis, but succeeded in alienating the urban poor and exposing the helplessness of municipal power in the face of systemic collapse. Starvation killed directly, but it also killed indirectly by destroying the body's ability to defend itself against illness. As the famine dragged on and malnutrition became universal among the peasant population, immune systems that had never been robust to begin with simply collapsed. The human body, deprived of adequate calories and essential nutrients over months and years, began to cannibalize itself, breaking down muscle tissue and depleting the reserves needed to fight off infection. Wounds that in normal times would have healed became infected and festered. Minor illnesses that a healthy person might shake off in days became life-threatening. Children, the elderly, and those already weakened by other conditions were the first to succumb, but eventually, even adults in what should have been the prime of life found themselves vulnerable to diseases they would ordinarily have survived. The famine had not merely taken away food, but had stripped away the biological resilience that separated life from death. Into this landscape of weakened bodies came waves of epidemic disease that turned the famine into a full-scale demographic catastrophe. Dysentery, spread through contaminated water, and poor sanitation swept through communities with devastating effect. The illness caused severe diarrhea and dehydration, conditions that in well-nourished individuals might be survivable, but that in starving people proved rapidly fatal. Entire villages were afflicted simultaneously, with families too weak to care for their sick, and the sick too far gone to recover even if care had been available. Typhus, transmitted by lice that thrived in the filthy, overcrowded conditions created by the famine, appeared in multiple regions. The disease caused high fever, delirium, and a characteristic rash, and it killed with horrifying efficiency in populations already on the edge of death. Other hunger-related illnesses compounded the misery. Edema, the swelling of tissues caused by protein deficiency, left people bloated and immobile. Scurvy appeared as vitamin C disappeared from diets that had been reduced to the barest essentials. Pellagra and other vitamin deficiency diseases caused skin lesions, digestive problems, and neurological damage. These were not separate crises from the famine, but direct consequences of it, the body's systems breaking down one by one as starvation stripped away everything needed for normal function. The mortality rates were staggering, though precise figures remain debated by historians due to the fragmentary nature of medieval record-keeping. Conservative estimates suggest that between 10 and 25% of the population in the most severely affected regions died during the famine years, with some localities experiencing even higher losses. In certain villages and towns, half the population or more disappeared, either dead or fled. As the sigh came in waves, with the very young and very old succumbing first, followed by those already weakened by pre-existing conditions, and finally even previously healthy adults, as the famine extended into its third and fourth years. Mass graves were dug to handle bodies that could not be given individual burials. Church records, which normally meticulously documented every death, became spotty or ceased entirely as priests themselves fell ill or fled. The landscape was transformed not just by abandoned fields, but by depopulated settlements, by churches with no congregations, by workshops with no craftsmen, by a sudden and terrible silence where life had been. For those who survived, the famine left permanent scars written into their very bones and flesh. Children who endured the worst years bore the marks of malnutrition for the rest of their lives. Skeletal remains from this period, studied by modern archaeologists, show clear evidence of stunted growth, with individuals reaching adulthood significantly shorter than they would have been had they received adequate nutrition during their developmental years. This was not merely a cosmetic effect, but reflected profound biological damage. Bones that should have grown strong remained thin and brittle. Teeth came in malformed or not at all. Cognitive development was impaired in children whose brains had been deprived of essential nutrients during critical periods of growth, leaving some with learning difficulties and reduced mental capacity. Adults who survived experienced permanent health damage that manifested in various ways. Reproductive capacity was compromised, with women suffering from amenorrhea and reduced fertility that persisted even after food supplies normalized. Organ damage from prolonged starvation and disease created chronic health problems that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life for decades after the famine ended. The generation that lived through the Great Famine carried its effects until their deaths, and in some cases passed on weakened constitutions to their children, creating echoes of the catastrophe that reverberated through subsequent generations. The famine had not simply killed millions, but had damaged the survivors in ways that would never fully heal, leaving an entire cohort of Europeans physically marked by the worst subsistence crisis the continent had experienced in centuries. The human mind, when confronted with suffering beyond comprehension, seeks patterns and meaning even where none may exist. For the people of medieval Europe, living through years of relentless starvation and death, the famine was not merely a meteorological or agricultural disaster, but a cosmic event that demanded theological explanation. The framework through which they understood their world was fundamentally religious, and so the catastrophe was inevitably interpreted through the lens of divine will. Preachers and theologians proclaimed that the famine was God's punishment for humanity's sins, a chastisement visited upon a corrupt and wayward generation that had strayed from righteousness. This explanation, however harsh, provided something that the reality of random climatic variation could not: purpose. If the suffering was divine judgment, then it was not meaningless chaos, but part of a moral order, and more importantly, it was something that could potentially be addressed through spiritual means. Villages organized collective acts of repentance, elaborate rituals designed to appease an angry God. Communities gathered in churches to confess their sins publicly. Flagellants whipped themselves in processions through the streets, and entire populations fasted voluntarily, adding religious deprivation to their already extreme physical want, in the hope that such demonstrations of piety might end the torment. These were not mere superstitions, but genuine attempts by desperate people to regain some sense of control over their fate, to believe that their actions mattered and that the nightmare could be ended through sufficient devotion and contrition. Yet alongside religious interpretation came a darker psychological adaptation: fatalism. As the famine extended from 1 year into 2, then 3, and in some places beyond, many people simply stopped believing that relief would come. The initial shock and horror gave way to a kind of numb acceptance, a recognition that death was not an aberration, but the likely outcome for most. This was not despair in the dramatic sense, but something quieter and more insidious, a fundamental recalibration of expectations about life and survival. Parents ceased to assume their children would reach adulthood. Young people stopped planning for futures that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The elderly accepted their approaching deaths without resistance, sometimes with a kind of relief that their suffering would end and they would no longer burden their families. This fatalism was in some ways a psychological defense mechanism, a way of protecting the mind from the constant trauma of loss and fear. To expect nothing was to never be disappointed, to never experience the crushing pain of hope deferred. Yet it also represented a profound erosion of the will to fight, a surrender to circumstance that made survival even less likely for those who succumbed to it completely. Within this landscape of religious seeking and fatalistic resignation, communities found a third form of psychological survival through the normalization of shared suffering. The famine was not happening to isolated individuals, but to entire villages, regions, nations. Everyone was hungry. Everyone had lost family members. Everyone lived on the edge of death. This universality of experience created a strange kind of solidarity, a collective endurance that was neither hopeful nor despairing, but simply focused on getting through one more day. Suffering that would have been unbearable in isolation became, if not bearable exactly, at least survivable when it was shared. People stopped expressing shock at conditions that would have horrified them years earlier. The sight of emaciated bodies, the knowledge that neighbors were eating things no human should eat, the daily toll of death, all of this became background reality, the new normal against which life continued in whatever diminished form it could. Conversations ceased to revolve around plans for the future and instead focused on immediate necessities, where a bit of grain might be found, which wild plants were safe to eat, who had died the night before. The psychological horizon collapsed inward until survival itself became not just the primary goal, but the only goal. In times of plenty, peasants had dreams however modest, a larger harvest, a better cottage, a future for their children that might be marginally less difficult than their own lives had been. The famine stripped away all such aspirations. Prosperity became a concept from another world, something remembered dimly from the time before the rains. Success was redefined as simply not dying today, as making it through another night, as seeing another dawn. This radical simplification of human ambition was both psychologically protective and culturally devastating. It allowed people to keep functioning when broader perspectives would have been overwhelming, but it also represented a profound impoverishment of human existence, a reduction of life to its most basic biological imperative. The survivors of the Great Famine would carry this psychological scarring forward, and for years after food supplies normalized, European culture would retain a haunted quality, a collective memory of the time when civilization had come within a breath of complete collapse, and when the only victory anyone could claim was the bare fact of having endured. The Great Famine killed indiscriminately, but it did not kill equally. Across Europe, certain peasants and certain communities weathered the catastrophe with losses that, while severe, were survivable, while others were nearly or completely wiped out. The difference between life and death often came down to factors that had nothing to do with personal virtue or effort, but everything to do with geography, legal status, and social connections that existed before the first rains fell. Survival was a lottery determined by circumstances largely beyond individual control, and understanding which peasants lived and which died reveals the hidden fault lines that ran through medieval rural society. Among the most critical determinants of survival was access to woodland and foraging areas. Peasants who lived near forests or commons where they held traditional rights to gather wild foods possessed a crucial safety net that those in purely agricultural regions lacked. When the grain harvests failed, these families could supplement their diets with resources the forest provided: nuts, berries, mushrooms, wild game if they could catch it, and edible plants that grew without cultivation. The legal right to access these areas mattered as much as their physical proximity. In some regions, aristocratic control over woodlands was absolute, and peasants caught foraging could be prosecuted for poaching regardless of their desperation. But in areas where customary rights of common access were well established and enforced, peasants could legally exploit these resources without fear of punishment. Villages situated at the edge of great forests or near expansive common lands thus had options available to them that communities surrounded entirely by cultivated fields did not. The difference could be measured in lives saved, families that made it through the famine weakened, but intact rather than destroyed. Proximity to rivers and the possession of fishing rights created another axis of inequality in survival. Fish represented a protein source that was independent of the grain harvest and could be obtained even when fields lay barren. Peasants who lived along rivers, streams, or near the coast, and who held legal rights to fish these waters, had access to calories and nutrients that purely agricultural populations could not obtain. In normal times, fish might be a supplementary food or a source of variety in an otherwise monotonous diet, but during the famine, it became a lifeline. Communities of fishermen, who had always existed somewhat apart from the grain-based economy, found their traditional poverty transformed into relative advantage when agricultural production collapsed. Even small-scale fishing, catching minnows and eels from streams, provided something to eat when there was nothing else. But again, legal access mattered enormously. Not all peasants near water had the right to fish it. Many rivers and their fisheries were jealously guarded by feudal lords or monasteries, and peasants caught fishing illegally faced harsh punishment. Those communities fortunate enough to possess established fishing rights, whether through ancient custom or specific grants from their lords, survived at higher rates than those who could only look at the water and watch others draw sustenance from it. The weight of feudal obligations, which varied significantly from one manor to another and one region to another, also played a decisive role in determining who lived and who died. Peasants burdened with heavy rents, multiple tithes, and extensive labor services found themselves with almost nothing left after their obligations were met, even in good years. When the harvests failed, they had no buffer whatsoever. Every grain of wheat was already spoken for, owed to a lord or the church, and consuming what was owed meant risking punishment, even as it might mean survival. In contrast, peasants whose feudal burdens were lighter, whether because their ancestors had negotiated better terms centuries earlier, or because their particular lord was less extractive, retained slightly larger portions of whatever meager harvest they managed to produce. That difference, a few extra bushels of grain or a slightly reduced rent, could mean the difference between having seed to plant the following year or having to consume it all. Communities in regions where serfdom was less severe, or where peasants had more legal protections and customary rights, survived at higher rates than those in areas of more intensive feudal exploitation. The famine did not create these inequalities, but it made them visible in the starkest possible terms, written in the mortality statistics that showed some villages nearly intact and others reduced to ghost towns. Family and kin networks, particularly their strength and extent, constituted another critical survival factor that operated below the level of legal rights or geographic fortune. Peasants embedded in large, cohesive family networks had people to fall back on when their own resources ran out. An extended family might pool resources with those who still had some grain sharing with relatives who had none, distributing the burden of scarcity across a wider base. Information flowed through kin networks as well. News of where food might be found, warnings about dangerous conditions, knowledge of survival strategies that had worked for others. Families with members in different locations, some in towns and others in the countryside, could potentially migrate toward whichever area was suffering less severely. Orphans and individuals without strong family connections had no such safety net. When their own supplies ran out, they starved alone, with no one obligated or willing to help them. The strength of these networks had been built over generations, through marriages carefully arranged to create alliances, through the maintenance of reciprocal obligations among cousins and in-laws, through the social capital accumulated by families who had lived in the same place for centuries. The famine tested these bonds, and in many cases destroyed them when scarcity made mutual aid impossible. But in the crucial early stages, when a little help could still make a difference, strong kin networks saved lives. Finally, geographic location relative to the hardest-hit grain regions created a map of differential survival across Europe. The famine was most severe in Northern and Western Europe, particularly in areas heavily dependent on grain cultivation, with little dietary diversity, regions that had more varied agricultural systems, where vegetables, legumes, and animal husbandry played larger roles alongside grain production, experienced less catastrophic outcomes. The Mediterranean regions, with their different climate patterns and agricultural traditions, were less severely affected than the rain-soaked north. Within affected areas, communities at higher elevations or in particularly waterlogged valleys suffered more than those on better drained land. Peasants who happened to live in these slightly less affected areas survived not because they were more capable or virtuous, but simply because the weather that destroyed their neighbors' crops left theirs merely damaged rather than completely ruined. Distance from administrative centers and major roads also mattered in unexpected ways. Remote villages were less likely to have their remaining supplies requisitioned by authorities or seized by passing armies, though they also had less access to whatever relief efforts did exist. The geography of survival was complex and often counterintuitive, but it was decisive. A peasant family living 50 miles in one direction might die while their near-identical counterparts, 50 miles in another direction, survived, separated not by any meaningful difference in ability or character, but by the contingencies of weather patterns and medieval geography that determined where the rain fell hardest and where it relented just enough to allow a partial harvest. The Great Famine did not end with a dramatic reversal of fortune or a sudden return to abundance, but rather faded gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the weather patterns that had devastated Europe for years slowly normalized. Beginning around 1317 and extending into the early 1320s, the relentless rainfall that had characterized the crisis years began to abate. Summers grew warmer and drier, allowing grain to ripen in the fields instead of rotting before harvest. The spring planting season ceased to be exercises in futility, as seeds could finally germinate in soil that was not perpetually waterlogged. By 1322, the worst was definitively over, and harvests across most of Europe had returned to levels that, while not approaching the abundance of the pre-famine period, were at least sufficient to prevent mass starvation. Yet this meteorological recovery, essential as it was, did not immediately restore the world that had existed before 1314. The famine had fundamentally altered the landscape, the economy, and the population of Europe in ways that would take decades to repair, and in some respects would never be fully reversed. One of the grimly ironic factors that helped end the acute phase of starvation was the catastrophic reduction in population that the famine itself had caused. Europe in 1322 was a continent with millions fewer mouths to feed than it had possessed in 1314. Entire villages had been depopulated, and even communities that survived had lost substantial portions of their inhabitants. This demographic collapse, achieved through years of death by starvation and disease, meant that the same amount of food that would have been desperately insufficient before the famine could now feed the survivors. The population had been forcibly brought back into balance with what the agricultural system could sustainably produce. though the mechanism by which this balance was achieved was among the most brutal in European history. Fields that had been inadequate to feed the pre-famine population were now, in many regions, more than sufficient for those who remained. The pressure that had built up over the 13th century, as population growth pushed against the limits of agricultural capacity, had been released through the deaths of millions. It was a Malthusian correction written in corpses and abandoned homesteads. Yet even with fewer people to feed and better weather, agricultural recovery proceeded with agonizing slowness, constrained by losses that could not be quickly replaced. The livestock populations that had been slaughtered during the famine years were gone, and rebuilding herds and flocks required time measured in generations of animals rather than seasons of crops. Draft animals, the oxen and horses essential for plowing large fields, had been among the first casualties when fodder ran out. Without them, peasants were reduced to pulling plows themselves or working smaller plots by hand, drastically reducing the acreage that could be cultivated. Breeding programs to restore animal populations required not only surviving breeding stock, which was scarce, but also sufficient fodder to keep the animals alive through multiple breeding cycles, and many regions still struggled to produce adequate hay harvests in the years immediately following the famine. The loss of seed grain, consumed in desperation during the worst years, created a deficit that took multiple good harvests to overcome. Even communities that managed to plant in 1317 or 1318 often did so with inadequate seed, resulting in thin crops that yielded less than normal and left little surplus to expand planting in subsequent years. The seed stock that had been carefully selected and preserved over centuries had been largely destroyed, and rebuilding it required patience and discipline that hungry people found difficult to maintain. Labor shortages compounded these agricultural challenges in ways that were both obvious and subtle. The most direct impact was simply that there were fewer hands available to work the fields. Communities that had once mustered dozens of workers for harvest could now barely assemble half that number. Fields that might have been fully cultivated in the past were left partially fallow because there was no one to plow, plant, or harvest them. But the labor shortage also had more complex economic effects. With workers scarce, peasants who survived found themselves in a stronger bargaining position relative to their lords than they had occupied before the famine. Some were able to negotiate reduced rents or better terms of service, taking advantage of lords' desperation to keep their remaining tenants from fleeing to other estates. This shift in the balance of power between labor and landowners would continue to develop over the following decades and would contribute to the eventual erosion of the feudal system, though that transformation was still many years in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the famine, the labor shortage simply meant that vast stretches of previously cultivated land returned to wilderness, a visible testament to the human cost of the catastrophe. The physical recovery of agriculture, slow as it was, proceeded far more quickly than the psychological healing of the societies that had endured the famine. The trauma of those years left scars that marked not just the generation that lived through them, but their children and grandchildren as well. People who had survived by eating things no human should eat, who had watched their families disintegrate, who had witnessed or participated in acts that violated every moral code they had been taught, carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Trust between neighbors, once broken by theft and betrayal during the desperate years, was not easily restored. The fatalism that had set in during the famine persisted long after food became available again, manifesting in a cultural pessimism and preoccupation with death that would characterize European art, literature, and religious expression for generations. the notion that disaster could strike without warning and destroy everything, that the social order could collapse and leave people entirely on their own, became embedded in the collective consciousness. Parish records and chronicles from the post-famine period are filled with references to the terrible years, invoked as warnings and benchmarks, against which all subsequent hardships were measured. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, less than 3 decades after the famine ended, it struck a population that was still psychologically vulnerable, still recovering from one catastrophe, and thus perhaps less resilient in the face of another. The Great Famine had demonstrated that the systems people depended on for survival, the agricultural economy, feudal obligations, religious charity, family bonds, could all fail simultaneously and completely. That knowledge, once learned, could not be unlearned, and it would shape European society's relationship with security, authority, and the future for centuries to come. The Great Famine did not simply end and fade from memory, but instead transformed the fundamental relationship between peasants and the structures that governed their lives. The experience of watching authorities fail so completely during the crisis years planted seeds of distrust that would grow and mature over the following decades. Peasants had witnessed their feudal lords hoarding grain while their tenants starved, had seen the church offer prayers instead of bread, had watched urban authorities impose ineffective regulations while people died in the streets. The implicit social contract of feudalism, the understanding that lords protected their dependents and the church cared for the poor in exchange for labor and obedience, had been revealed as conditional at best and fraudulent at worst. This disillusionment did not immediately translate into open rebellion. The power structures of medieval society remained intact and enforced by violence, but it created a fundamental skepticism about the legitimacy of authority that would surface in various forms over the coming generations. When lords demanded increased rents or labor services in the post-famine period, they encountered resistance that would have been unthinkable before 1314. Peasants who had survived the worst catastrophe in living memory without meaningful help from their supposed protectors were less inclined to accept exploitation passively. This shift was subtle and varied by region, but it represented a genuine change in consciousness, a recognition that survival ultimately depended on one's own efforts and community solidarity, rather than on the beneficence of social superiors. The physical landscape of rural Europe was permanently altered by the famine in ways that reflected new realities and new priorities. The marginal lands that had been brought under cultivation during the population boom of the 13th century, those hillsides and wetlands and thin soils that had always been barely productive, were largely abandoned and never reclaimed. Communities had learned a harsh lesson about the dangers of overextension, and the post-famine period saw a consolidation of agricultural activity onto the best and most reliable lands. This represented a more conservative approach to land use, a recognition that security mattered more than maximizing production at the edge of sustainability. Village layouts changed as depopulated settlements reorganized themselves around smaller cores, with outlying farms and cottages left to decay. Some regions saw a shift away from pure grain monoculture toward more diversified agricultural systems that included larger vegetable gardens, more emphasis on animal husbandry where possible, and the preservation of access to woodland and fishing resources that had proven so valuable during the crisis. This diversification was not universal. Many areas remained locked into grain production by feudal obligations and market demands, but where peasants had any autonomy in deciding what to grow, there was a clear movement towards strategies that provided more resilience against future crop failures. The collective memory of what had saved lives during the famine influenced agricultural decision-making for generations. In certain regions, particularly those that had suffered the most severe depopulation, the famine created conditions that weakened feudal control in ways that would have seemed impossible before the crisis. The fundamental logic of feudalism depended on an oversupply of labor relative to available land, which gave lords the power to extract heavy obligations from peasants who had no alternative. But the demographic collapse changed this equation dramatically in the hardest-hit areas. With villages half empty and fields lying fallow for lack of workers, lords found themselves competing for the labor of surviving peasants rather than taking it for granted. Some peasants simply fled from estates where conditions were particularly oppressive, moving to regions where desperate lords offered better terms to attract settlers. The legal mechanisms that were supposed to prevent such mobility, serfdom laws that bound peasants to the land, became increasingly difficult to enforce when enforcement required a level of administrative capacity and manpower that many manors no longer possessed. In parts of England, France, and the Low Countries, the post-famine decades saw a gradual but real improvement in peasant conditions as labor scarcity forced concessions from the landowning class. Rents were reduced, labor services were commuted to money payments, and in some cases peasants were able to negotiate formal improvements in their legal status. This process was uneven and often reversed when population began to recover, but it established precedents and created expectations that would fuel later conflicts. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 and similar uprisings elsewhere drew on grievances that had been gestating since the famine years, as peasants who had tasted slightly better conditions resisted attempts by authorities to reimpose the old order. The Great Famine also served, in a grimly practical sense, as a dress rehearsal for the even greater catastrophe that would arrive a generation later. When the Black Death reached Europe in 1348, it struck a society that was still recovering from the demographic and economic damage of the famine, a population that had been weakened by years of malnutrition and had not yet rebuilt to pre-famine levels. Some historians argue that the famine made the plague worse by leaving a population that was less physically resilient and less able to mount effective immune responses to the disease. More broadly, the famine had demonstrated that European civilization was far more fragile than anyone had previously understood, that the systems of production and distribution could fail completely, and that when they did, the consequences were catastrophic. The institutional responses to the plague, the panic, the breakdown of social order, the desperate searches for scapegoats, echoed patterns that had first emerged during the famine. European society in the mid-14th century was dealing with its second existential crisis in 30 years, and the cumulative effect of both disasters would reshape the continent's demographic, economic, and cultural landscape in ways that marked the end of the High Middle Ages and the beginning of a new and more troubled era. Perhaps most significantly, the Great Famine established itself as a permanent fixture in medieval memory, a baseline of suffering against which all subsequent hardships would be measured. For generations after the crisis ended, the famine years were invoked in chronicles, sermons, and oral tradition as the ultimate example of divine punishment and human misery. Parents who had lived through it told their children stories of what they had endured, creating a transgenerational trauma that shaped attitudes toward food, security, and the future. The famine became a cultural touchstone, referenced in literature and art as shorthand for apocalyptic suffering. When later crises occurred, harvest failures, epidemics, wars, they were routinely compared to the Great Hunger of 1315 and 1316, and the comparison always served to emphasize either how terrible the new crisis was, if it approached those legendary horrors, or how much better things were if they did not. This collective memory had practical effects as well. Communities that remembered the famine were more likely to maintain emergency grain reserves, more careful about preserving seed stock, more insistent on retaining access to forests and waterways that had provided emergency food. The memory also reinforced a certain fatalism about the human condition, a recognition that suffering was inevitable and that the good times, when they came, were temporary and not to be taken for granted. Medieval European culture after 1322 was marked by a preoccupation with death and decay, with the transience of earthly life and the vanity of human ambition. Much of this sensibility can be traced to the plague years, but its roots lie in the famine that came first, the catastrophe that taught an entire civilization that everything could be taken away, that survival was never guaranteed, and that in the end, each person stood alone before forces too vast and too indifferent to be controlled or even fully understood. The truth about survival during the Great Famine is far less uplifting than the narratives of human triumph that often accompany discussions of historical catastrophe. There were no heroes in this story, no brilliant strategies that allowed communities to overcome adversity through ingenuity and determination. The reality was much darker and more uncomfortable. Survival was brutal, often morally compromising, and profoundly unequal in ways that had nothing to do with virtue or effort. Those who lived through the famine did not conquer it, but simply endured it, absorbing deprivation and loss until the crisis finally exhausted itself and moved on. Understanding this distinction is essential to grasping what the famine truly meant for the millions of ordinary people who experienced it. The peasants who survived did not do so because they were cleverer or stronger or more resourceful than those who died. They survived because they were willing to do whatever was necessary to keep breathing for one more day, and because certain accidents of geography, social position, and timing worked in their favor. Survival meant eating things that poison the body slowly, rather than starving quickly. It meant watching family members die and making calculated decisions about who would receive the last scraps of food and who would be left to fade away. It meant violating moral codes that had governed behavior for lifetimes, stealing from neighbors, abandoning children, consuming flesh that should never have been consumed. These were not acts of heroism, but acts of desperation, the kinds of choices that left those who made them traumatized and morally scarred, even when they succeeded in keeping themselves alive. The survivors were not victors but casualties, who happened not to die, people who had been broken by the experience even as their bodies continued to function. The narrative of survival as triumph obscures the most important aspect of the famine experience. Most peasants who lived through it did so not by overcoming deprivation, but by enduring it passively, by absorbing punishment that no human being should have to absorb, and continuing to exist in a state that could barely be called living. They did not solve the problem of hunger, because the problem had no solution available to people at their level of society. They could not make it rain less, or make grain grow in waterlogged fields. They could not compel their lords to share hoarded supplies, or force the church to provide meaningful relief. They had no power to change the conditions that were killing them, and so they simply suffered those conditions day after day, month after month, year after year, until external factors beyond their control, the gradual normalization of weather patterns, finally allowed the crisis to ease. This is not a story of human agency triumphing over adversity, but of human beings reduced to passive endurance, stripped of everything except the biological imperative to continue existing. The inequality of survival is perhaps the most difficult aspect to reconcile with comfortable narratives about shared human resilience. The famine did not test everyone equally, and did not reward virtue or punish vice in any systematic way. It killed based on accidents of birth and circumstance that were entirely beyond individual control. A peasant born in a village with access to fishing rights had better odds than an identical peasant born 20 miles away without such access. A family whose ancestors had negotiated lighter feudal burdens generations earlier survived at higher rates than families crushed by heavier obligations, regardless of how hard either worked or how carefully they managed their resources. Children born into large, well-connected kin networks had safety nets that orphans lacked through no fault of their own. The survivors were not necessarily the most deserving or the most capable, but simply the fortunate, those whose particular combination of circumstances happened to be slightly less lethal than average. This randomness, this fundamental unfairness, makes the famine harder to narrativize in ways that provide moral lessons or inspire confidence in human potential. The lesson it teaches is darker, that individual effort matters far less than we would like to believe when confronting systemic catastrophes, and that survival can be as much about luck as about anything within human control. What the Great Famine ultimately exposed was the terrifying thinness of the margin on which medieval life operated. Before 1314, European society had seemed, at least to those living within it, reasonably stable and sustainable. There were hardships, certainly, and life for peasants was never easy, but the system functioned. Communities fed themselves year after year. The feudal order maintained itself, and while people died young and often, society itself continued. The famine revealed that this apparent stability was an illusion resting on the narrowest possible foundation. A few years of bad weather, an entirely natural climatic fluctuation with no supernatural cause, was sufficient to bring the entire structure crashing down. The agricultural system had no resilience, no capacity to absorb shocks or adapt to changing conditions. The social institutions had no meaningful mechanisms for protecting vulnerable populations when crisis struck. The economic arrangements concentrated resources in the hands of elites who were unwilling to redistribute them, even when redistribution might have saved thousands of lives. Everything that seemed solid and permanent was shown to be fragile and contingent, dependent on the continuation of favorable conditions that could not be guaranteed. This exposure of fragility had profound implications that extended far beyond the immediate death toll. It revealed to medieval Europeans that their world was not secure, that the systems they depended on could fail completely, and that when they did, there would be no rescue. The comfortable assumptions that had governed life, that the harvest would come, that the church would provide charity, that lords would protect their people, that families would stay together, all proved conditional when tested by genuine crisis. And once that lesson was learned, once people understood how close to the edge they actually lived, the psychological landscape of Europe was permanently altered. The confidence and optimism that had characterized the High Middle Ages, the sense that Christendom was strong and expanding and secure, was replaced by a darker worldview that recognized the possibility of collapse at any moment. The Great Famine was not simply a demographic event or an economic disruption, but a revelation, a moment when the curtain was pulled back and medieval society saw itself clearly for the first time, saw how little separated civilization from chaos and survival from extinction. That knowledge, harsh and unwelcome as it was, could never be unknown, and it would shape European consciousness through all the catastrophes that followed.